Imagine the map of Eastern Europe right now. If Western support for Ukraine completely dries up and the Ukrainian conventional military is overwhelmed, we would see a thick red line push rapidly westward. Russia declares victory, redraws the borders, and claims the war is over. But that declaration doesn't bring peace. On day one of this occupation, Moscow installs a puppet government in Kyiv. They immediately begin forced cultural assimilation, erasing Ukrainian identity from schools, local laws, and public life. Because the Russian economy is heavily strained by military spending and sanctions, they resort to what analysts call cheap management. The shattered cities and power grids aren't rebuilt. They are left to rot, plunging the remaining population into years of scarcity and decay. Faced with that reality, millions of people pack whatever they can carry. We are looking at a projected mass exodus of up to 20 million refugees pouring across the borders into neighboring European countries. This is what a forced surrender actually looks like. It doesn't create regional stability. It simply takes a catastrophic humanitarian disaster and exports it directly onto the doorstep of the rest of Europe. There is an assumption that if the formal Ukrainian army collapses, the fighting stops. But millions of Ukrainian civilians now have military-grade weapons, and they have spent the last few years receiving extensive combat training from Western forces. They also share a deeply ingrained historical memory. In the 1930s, millions of Ukrainians died under Soviet rule through systematic starvation known as the Holodomor. They know exactly what living under Moscow's total control means, and they will fight to avoid repeating it. Instead of trench warfare, the conflict immediately shifts into the shadows. We would see a coordinated campaign of guerrilla tactics, car bombings, sabotaged supply lines, and targeted assassinations aimed directly at Russian occupation officials and local collaborators. We have seen this exact dynamic before. During the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, a heavily armed, highly motivated local insurgency ground the Soviet military down for nearly a decade. A conventional military victory for Russia doesn't end the violence. It turns Ukraine into an ungovernable, highly lethal insurgency right in Russia's new backyard, bleeding their forces dry for decades. Some policymakers argue that fighting an endless insurgency in Ukraine would leave Russia too exhausted to pose a threat to NATO. The math tells a different story. Conquering Ukraine physically transfers a massive stockpile of resources directly to Moscow. It operates like a hostile corporate takeover, turning an independent country into a resource engine for Putin's regime. First, Russia absorbs Ukraine's massive Soviet-era military-industrial complex. During the Cold War, Ukrainian factories produced a huge portion of the USSR's tanks, missiles, and warships. Reactivating these facilities allows Moscow to rapidly replace their battlefield losses, bypassing Western sanctions on heavy manufacturing. Second, the Kremlin seizes control of trillions of dollars in untapped mineral wealth, located primarily in Ukraine's eastern and southern regions, providing a massive new revenue stream. Third, looking at this chart of global agricultural exports, we see what happens when Russia swallows up the famed Ukrainian breadbasket. It achieves total dominance over global food supply. Moscow gains the power to weaponize food security, threatening famine to punish its enemies and rewarding allies with cheap grain. By capturing these specific industrial, mineral, and agricultural assets, Russia doesn't emerge from the war depleted. They emerge as a self-sustaining, highly resourced military threat. They also gain something even more valuable: manpower. A victorious Russia would immediately force hundreds of thousands of surviving Ukrainian citizens into conscription to rebuild the ranks of the Russian army. With a replenished military and a new western border, Moscow's gaze shifts. The immediate next targets for this expanded war machine are neighboring states like Moldova, the Baltics, and Poland. To deter this immediate aggressive posture, European nations would be forced to drastically increase their defense budgets. Many countries would have to double their military spending overnight just to maintain basic security. If Russia successfully digests Ukraine, a direct, conventional clash between NATO and Russian forces stops being a theoretical worst-case scenario. It instead becomes an active, ticking countdown. We have to zoom out and look at the broader global stage. When the United States and Europe allow a democratic ally to be conquered, the consequences ripple far beyond Eastern Europe. This flowchart illustrates the core calculation. If the US and Europe decide against continuing support, it broadcasts a clear message: the West lacks resolve. Watching this play out, nations across the global south recognize the shift, pivoting toward Moscow to secure their futures. This pivot has immediate, tangible results. Arms, technology, and diplomatic cover start flowing freely from these newly aligned countries directly into Russia, completely nullifying any remaining Western economic sanctions. By abandoning Ukraine, the West effectively shatters its own diplomatic credibility. The United States and Europe find themselves isolated and outmaneuvered on the world stage. This document represents the bedrock principle of international law since World War II, the prohibition of aggressive war, and the rule that borders cannot simply be changed by force. A Russian victory shreds these agreements entirely. Once that rule is broken, a dangerous domino effect begins to unfold. Revisionist powers around the globe watch the West's failure closely. Nations like China, eyeing Taiwan, interpret this as a green light to launch military offensives. We enter the post-Western era, a global landscape where unprovoked military aggression finally pays off, and the international rules-based order that provided decades of relative stability no longer exists. Walking away from Ukraine might look like a quick way to stop a regional war, but a peace achieved through surrender doesn't bring stability. It serves as a down payment on a larger, perpetual global conflict.